Before we drift into the peculiar tale of why the Pope nearly outlawed pillow fights, let me gently remind you that if you enjoy these bizarre bedtime stories, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more oddities from history's forgotten corners. Now, let us sink into the first chapter of this fluffy, feather-strewn saga d'ort. Chapter 1. The Fluffy Uprising. In the year of our Lord 1378, the nobility of Europe had grown weary of the usual entertainments, jousting, feasting, plotting against one another. They craved something new, something absurd, something that would allow them to release their pent-up frustrations without the mess of actual violence. And so, like a plague of lethargic locusts, the trend of pillow fights descended upon the courts of Christendom. It began innocently enough. A bored duchess in Burgundy, tired of her husband snoring, tossed a cushion at his head. He, in turn, retaliated with a decorative bolster. Before long, their entire retinue was embroiled in a battle so fierce it left the tapestries askew and several feather-stuffed casualties gasping for breath. Word spread. Soon, no castle was safe from the muffled thuds of silk-clad warfare. The rules were simple. No swords, no daggers, only pillows. But as with all things involving the aristocracy, it quickly spiraled out of control. Pillows were no longer mere bedding. They became instruments of status. The wealthiest lords commissioned pillows stuffed with the finest goose down, embroidered with their coats of arms. Some even lined them with hidden weights, turning what was meant to be a gentle pastime into a sport with genuine risk of concussion. Then came the leagues. Competitive pillow fighting became the rage, with tournaments held in grand halls, where knights traded their armor for nightcaps and their lances for overstuffed sacks of feathers. The bouts were scored by jesters who themselves were often caught in the crossfire. Injuries mounted. A count in Aachen famously broke his nose on a particularly well-stuffed bolster. A baroness in Toulouse fainted from exhaustion after a 3-hour duel. The church, ever watchful of moral decay, began to take notice. At first, the clergy dismissed it as a harmless folly. But when rumors reached Rome that a cardinal's nephew had been knocked unconscious during a midnight skirmish in Avignon, the Vatican could no longer ignore the problem. The Pope himself, Urban VI, a man not known for his sense of humor, received reports of noblemen skipping mass to practice their pillow-swinging techniques. Even worse, some enterprising souls had begun selling indulgences to absolve participants of the sin of excessive soft violence. The final straw came when a group of overzealous knights, inspired by the pillow fights, attempted to reenact the Battle of Crécy using nothing but bed linens. The resulting chaos, feathers floating like snow over the battlefield, servants slipping on scattered cushions, a duke nearly suffocating under a mountain of decorative shams, was too much for the Holy See to bear. And so, in the autumn of 1380, Pope Urban VI drafted a papal bull that would have banned pillow fights outright, declaring them a frivolous and ungodly distraction from piety. The document was ready. The ink was dry. But at the last moment, a single, well-placed pillow, launched by a mischievous choirboy, struck the Pope square in the face during a private audience. Urban VI, for the first time in his reign, laughed. The ban was never issued. The craze eventually faded, as all fads do, but the legacy of the Fluffy Uprising lingered. To this day, if you listen closely in the halls of ancient castles, you might still hear the ghostly thump of pillows colliding in the dark, a whisper of a time when Europe's nobility nearly brought itself to ruin over the softest of weapons. Chapter 2. Pillows as weapons. By the time the nobility of Europe had fully embraced the pillow fight as a pastime, it had ceased to be a mere game. What began as a frivolous distraction had evolved into something far more sinister, a sport of calculated brutality disguised beneath layers of silk and down. The pillows themselves had undergone a transformation, no longer simple objects of comfort, but weapons of war, meticulously engineered for maximum impact. The first documented case of a pillow-related injury occurred in the court of King Charles V of France, where a visiting margrave from Saxony, known for his particularly stiff bolster, delivered a blow so forceful that his opponent, a minor baron with a fondness for extravagant headwear, was knocked clean off his feet. The baron's elaborate hat remained suspended in the air for a full second before landing in a tureen of soup. Witnesses reported that the margrave had spent weeks training for the event, swinging his pillow at a straw dummy until his arms ached. This was no longer child's play. This was combat. Soon, the nobility began to approach pillow fights with the same seriousness as they did jousting or fencing. Blacksmiths, normally tasked with forging swords and armor, found themselves consulted on the best methods to reinforce pillowcases without sacrificing flexibility. Some experimented with lead beads stitched into the seams, while others wove horsehair into the batting to create a denser, more punishing weapon. A particularly cunning lord in Milan commissioned a pillow lined with thin strips of whalebone, ensuring his strikes would leave bruises even through the thickest of nightgowns. The injuries mounted. A knight in Aragon suffered a dislocated shoulder after an overzealous swing sent him spinning into a stone pillar. A duchess in Vienna, renowned for her delicate constitution, fainted when struck squarely in the chest by a pillow packed with barley husks, an early attempt at weighted filling. The most infamous incident occurred in the court of the Duke of Burgundy, where a well-aimed pillow, thrown with the precision of a trebuchet, knocked a visiting bishop's mitre clean off his head. The bishop, not known for his forgiving nature, promptly declared the act an affront to the church, and stormed out, leaving behind a trail of muttered Latin curses. The violence was not limited to the nobility. Servants, often caught in the crossfire, began wearing padded caps to protect themselves from stray blows. Some enterprising peasants even started a black market trade in battle-ready pillows, smuggling them into castles under the guise of delivering fresh linens. One particularly bold merchant in Florence was caught selling pillows stuffed with crushed walnut shells, which, while devastating in a duel, made for an exceptionally poor night's sleep. The church, ever watchful of moral decay, took notice of the escalating brutality. A minor cleric in Rome, after witnessing a particularly brutal bout between two cardinals during a papal conclave, penned a treatise titled On the Sinful Nature of Excessive Pillory. In it he argued that the sport had strayed too far from its innocent origins, and now posed a genuine threat to the souls of its participants. For what is a pillow, he wrote, if not a tool of sloth, repurposed as an instrument of wrath? His words fell on deaf ears. The nobility, having found a new outlet for their aggression, were not about to give it up. Even the rules of engagement had become twisted. What had once been a free-for-all of flailing limbs and laughter had devolved into a strict code of conduct, with referees, timed rounds, and even wagering. A particularly ruthless count in Bohemia was known to challenge guests to feather duels, where the loser was forced to sleep on the floor for the night, a humiliation considered worse than any physical injury. By the time whispers of the Pope's potential ban began to circulate, the damage was already done. Pillow fighting had become an institution, a bizarre yet undeniable fixture of medieval life. And though the church would eventually step in, the legacy of these feather-filled battles would linger, a testament to humanity's endless capacity to turn even the softest objects into weapons. Somewhere, in the forgotten corners of Europe's grandest castles, there are still pillows that bear the scars of those days. Faded stains from spilled wine, frayed seams from too many violent impacts, and the occasional feather, stubbornly clinging to life. A silent witness to the time when the nobility nearly beat each other senseless, with Bedtime except. Chapter 3. The Church's Dilemma. For years, the Church had turned a blind eye to the nobility's pillow-fighting obsession. After all, men and women of high birth had always indulged in eccentric pastimes, hunting unicorns, commissioning self-portraits with suspiciously elongated fingers, betting on which of their servants could stand motionless the longest. A few feather-filled scuffles among bored aristocrats hardly seemed worth noting. But by the late 14th century, what had once been an amusing diversion had spiraled into something far more troubling. An outright rejection of pious austerity in favor of unrestrained, pillow-flinging decadence. The first murmurs of concern came from monastic orders, where brothers who had taken vows of poverty and humility watched in dismay as local lords hosted lavish pillow feasts, entire evenings dedicated to staged pillow battles, followed by banquets where guests reclined on mountains of cushions like Roman emperors. Some nobles even began wearing their finest sleeping attire to these events, parading through halls in embroidered nightgowns, as if they were royal vestments. To the monks, it was not just frivolous, it was blasphemous. Matters worsened when the trend infiltrated religious holidays. In the German principalities, where Lent was traditionally a time of fasting and reflection, certain knights began organizing Easter smite festivals, where participants would pelt one another with pillows in symbolic reenactments of biblical battles. One particularly irreverent lord in Bavaria staged a mock David and Goliath duel, though Goliath, played by a giant of a man with a goose-down stuffed sack, won every time. The local bishop, upon hearing of this, nearly choked on his own pectoral cross. The church's tolerance wore thinner still when rumors spread that some nobles were skipping mass entirely, preferring instead to hold clandestine pillow fights in empty chapels. A scandal erupted in Florence when a group of young aristocrats was caught staging a midnight bout in the sacristy of Santa Maria del Fiore, using altar cloths as makeshift pillowcases. The Archbishop, upon discovering them, was said to have turned a shade of crimson previously unseen in nature. Yet the real tipping point came when the trend spread to the clergy itself. At first it was just a few low-ranking priests and deacons, men who had grown up in noble households and still harbored a fondness for the sport. But soon, even cardinals were rumored to partake. A particularly damning report reached Rome of a bishop in Avignon, who, after a particularly tedious session of ecclesiastical debate, challenged his fellow clergymen to an impromptu pillow fight in the papal palace's antechamber. Witnesses claimed that the resulting chaos, mitres knocked askew, rosary beads tangled in flying feathers, an elderly canon momentarily buried beneath a heap of bolsters, was as undignified as it was hilarious. Pope Urban VI, a man not known for his patience, had initially dismissed the reports as exaggerated gossip. But when his own nephew, a cardinal known more for his love of luxury than his piety, was caught hosting a pillow tournament in his private apartments, complete with wagering and a ceremonial pillow blessing beforehand, the pontiff could no longer ignore the problem. The issue was not merely the violence, nor even the wastefulness, though the sheer number of perfectly good cushions being destroyed in the name of sport was, to the frugal-minded Urban, a sin in itself. The true danger lay in what the pillow fights represented: a rejection of discipline, a celebration of excess, a sneering disregard for the solemnity that ought to govern Christian life. In an age where the Church was already battling schisms, heresies, and the occasional self-proclaimed Messiah, the last thing it needed was its own clergy whacking each other with betting like overexcited children. Yet banning the practice outright was no simple matter. The nobility, already bristling at the Church's growing influence in secular affairs, would not take kindly to being told they could not enjoy their favorite pastime. Worse still, some of the most enthusiastic pillow fighters were powerful patrons of the Church, men whose donations kept cathedrals standing and monasteries fed. To alienate them risked more than just bruised egos. It risked empty coffers. For weeks, the papal court debated the matter in hushed tones. Some argued for a full prohibition, citing the sport's corrupting influence. Others suggested a compromise, regulating pillow fights, perhaps even sanctioning them as a harmless release for noble aggression. One particularly inventive theologian proposed rebranding them as acts of penance. If a man must strike another, let it be with a soft instrument, and let him pray afterward for forgiveness. Urban VI, ever the pragmatist, knew that outright condemnation would only make the sport more appealing. Instead, he settled on a subtler approach. In a carefully worded sermon, delivered to a gathering of cardinals, he spoke of the virtues of moderation, of the dangers of excess, of the need for men of God to set an example. He did not mention pillow fights directly, but his meaning was clear. The message was received by some. Many nobles, particularly the younger and more rebellious, took it as a challenge. If the church disapproved, then pillow fighting became not just a game, but an act of defiance. Secret societies of pillow enthusiasts sprang up, their members communicating through coded messages hidden in embroidery. In some courts, the sport became a test of loyalty. Those who refused to partake were suspected of being too cozy with the clergy. And so the church found itself in an absurd position, waging a silent war against pillows. It was a battle they could not afford to lose. For if men could not be trusted to restrain themselves with something as harmless as a cushion, what hope was there for their immortal souls? Meanwhile, in castles and cathedrals across Europe, feathers continued to fly, softly, relentlessly, and with increasing subversion. The pillow, once a humble object of rest, had become a weapon not just of physical force, but of ideological rebellion. And the Church, for all its power, had no idea how to stop it. Chapter 4. The Night of 1,000 Feathers. It began, as most catastrophes do, with the best of intentions. The young Duke of Lorraine, eager to prove himself a patron of both sport and culture, announced a grand tournament unlike any seen before, a championship pillow fight to be held in the great square of Nancy, open to all nobles of good standing. The rules were simple: teams of 12, 1 pillow per combatant, and victory awarded to whichever side could either disarm their opponents or render them too breathless to continue. The Duke, in a stroke of what he considered genius, had commissioned hundreds of identical pillows stuffed with the finest goose down from Hungary, ensuring no team could claim advantage through superior equipment. The invitation spread through Europe like a yawn in chapel. Knights adjusted their training regimens, swapping sword drills for pillow swings. Ladies practiced their defensive maneuvers, tucking their hair into elaborate nets to prevent feather entanglement. Even merchants saw opportunity, setting up stalls near the tournament grounds selling reinforced gloves, featherproof cloaks, and, for reasons no one could quite explain, tiny wooden models of famous pillows from history. By the time the appointed day arrived, the city swelled with visitors, its inns overflowing and its streets buzzing with wagers, boasts, and the occasional experimental swing of a practice pillow. The tournament commenced at dusk, lit by hundreds of lanterns that cast flickering shadows across the square. The first matches passed without incident, though the crowd murmured in disapproval when the favored team from Burgundy was disqualified after their captain was caught smuggling lead pellets into his pillow. Tensions rose as the night wore on, particularly after an unfortunate incident involving the Archbishop of Trier's nephew and an errant pillow that somehow found its way into a vat of wine. It was during the semi-final match that things turned. The team from Flanders, known for their unorthodox swarm technique, faced off against a group of Italian knights who favored precise, almost surgical strikes. What began as a spirited contest soon escalated when the Flemish captain, struck particularly hard in the ribs, accused his opponent of using an illegal double-stuffed pillow. The Italians responded by unfastening their opponent's belt mid-swing, sending his trousers to his ankles mid-combat. The crowd roared with laughter. The Flemish team did not. One moment, the square was filled with the rhythmic thump of pillows meeting flesh. The next, it was chaos. A Flemish knight, in a fit of indignation, hurled his pillow not at his opponent, but at the judge's stand. It struck the Duke's cupbearer, who promptly dropped a flagon of wine onto the Duke's lap. The Duke stood. Whether to reprimand the knight or to change his trousers, history does not record. But the movement was interpreted as a signal. Someone in the crowd, swept up in the frenzy, threw their own pillow. Then another. Then 100 more. Within minutes, the tournament had dissolved into a free-for-all. Nobles pelted each other indiscriminately. Servants, caught between their master's pride and their own sense of self-preservation, ducked behind overturned tables. Merchants hastily shuttered their stalls as pillows rained down like oversized hailstones. The city guard, attempting to intervene, found themselves targeted from all sides. One particularly beleaguered sergeant later reported being struck by no fewer than 17 pillows in under a minute. And then the seams began to burst. The Duke's Hungarian goose-down pillows, while luxurious, had not been designed for sustained combat. One by one, they split open, filling the air with a swirling storm of feathers. The square became a blizzard of white, the lanterns casting eerie shadows through the flurry. Combatants coughed and sputtered as down filled their mouths and noses. Horses, already skittish from the noise, reared and bolted, dragging half-dismantled merchant carts behind them. A group of nuns, passing through on their way to midnight prayers, found themselves caught in the crossfire. After a brief moment of hesitation, joined the fray with surprising ferocity. By dawn, the city resembled the aftermath of a particularly festive avalanche. Feathers clung to every surface, nestled in hair, piled in drifts against doorways, floating lazily in the river. The townsfolk emerged cautiously, some still clutching pillows as if expecting another round. The Duke, surveying the damage from his, now stained, ceremonial chair, declared the tournament concluded, though no winner was officially named. The Church's response was swift. A week later, a papal envoy arrived in Nancy, his expression suggesting he had smelled something foul long before entering the city. The Duke was reprimanded, the tournament declared an occasion of sin, and stricter limits placed on public gatherings involving pillows. But the damage was done. The Night of 1,000 Feathers passed into legend, whispered about in taverns, and chronicled in increasingly exaggerated accounts. To this day, the people of Nancy claim that, when the wind blows just right, a few stray feathers still rise from the cobblestones, ghosts of a night when nobility and commoners alike forgot themselves in the great, ridiculous, feather-choked joy of battle. And though the Duke's name is remembered for many things, none cling to history quite so tenaciously as those 1,000 feathers, drifting slowly down through the centuries. Chapter 5. The Pope's Patience Wears Thin. The report of the Night of 1,000 Feathers reached Pope Urban VI as he broke his fast on a modest meal of bread and watered wine. The messenger, a dust-streaked friar from Nancy, hesitated before delivering the full account, watching as the Pope's knuckles grew progressively whiter around his goblet. When the description reached the part where the nuns had joined the fray, the pontiff set down his cup with such deliberate care that several cardinals in attendance later confessed they found the controlled motion more frightening than any outburst of temper. For months, Urban VI had attempted subtle measures to curb the pillow-fighting epidemic. He had issued discreet admonishments through bishops, encouraged sermons on temperance, even sanctioned the writing of a theological treatise titled Beyond the Moral Perils of Excessive Softness. None of it had worked. If anything, the problem had worsened. What had once been contained to noble estates now spilled into the very streets of Christendom, and worse, into its sacred spaces. Only the week before, a Palm Sunday procession in Bologna had been disrupted when a group of young nobles, apparently unable to resist the sight of so many people gathered in one place, initiated an impromptu pillow battle during the reading of the Gospel. The resulting chaos saw palms trampled, elderly canons knocked aside, and one particularly unfortunate deacon buried beneath a mountain of decorative cushions that had been meant for the bishop's seating. The local clergy wrote to Rome in despair, lamenting that they could no longer distinguish between the holy rustle of palm fronds and the ominous whoosh of incoming pillows. Then came the incident at the Council of Basel. The ecclesiastical gathering, meant to address pressing matters of church reform, had barely commenced when two German bishops, longtime rivals, settled a theological dispute by challenging each other to a pillow duel behind the choir stalls. Witnesses disagreed on whether the argument had been about transubstantiation or who had stolen whose favorite quill pen, but all agreed the fight itself had been spectacularly unchristian. One bishop had come prepared with a pillow, reinforced with what appeared to be thin strips of boiled leather. The other retaliated by swinging his pillow with such force that it burst upon impact, showering the assembled clergy in a blizzard of goose, down that clung to their vestments through 3 days of subsequent debates. Urban VI's tolerance, never robust to begin with, now hung by the thinnest of threads. His advisers watched with growing unease as the Pope began inserting pointed references to frivolous pursuits and unseemly softness into every sermon. When a visiting French cardinal made the mistake of joking that perhaps the Vatican should commission special ceremonial pillows for liturgical use, Urban fixed him with a stare so glacial that the man reportedly developed a cough that lingered for weeks. The breaking point came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. The Pope had just begun his private devotions when a commotion erupted in the courtyard below his window. Peering out, he beheld a sight that would haunt his dreams for months. 2 of his own Swiss guards, men sworn to protect his person with their lives, engaged in a vigorous pillow fight while off duty. Even worse, they were using the ceremonial cushions from the Chapel of the Sacrament as weapons. One particularly forceful swing sent a golden-tasseled pillow soaring through the air and through the open window of the papal apartments, where it landed at Urban's feet with a soft, accusatory plop. For a long moment, the entire Vatican seemed to hold its breath. Then Pope Urban VI, Vicar of Christ, successor of St. Peter, and Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, did something no living soul had ever witnessed. He picked up the pillow, examined its embroidered cross, now slightly askew from rough handling, with the terrible precision of a man pushed beyond all endurance, hurled it back out the window with a shout that startled pigeons from their roosts across Rome. The next morning, notices appeared on church doors across Europe. Drafted in the Pope's own terse Latin, they bore no elaborate theological arguments, no patient explanations, just 7 uncompromising words. Ludus cervicalium omnino et in aeternum prohibetur. The playing of pillow fights is henceforth and forever prohibited. For the first time in living memory, the nobility fell silent. Even the most ardent pillow enthusiasts paused mid-swing when word spread that Urban had authorized local bishops to impose excommunication on offenders. The sudden seriousness of the situation became clear when the Duke of Milan, upon being informed of the ban, immediately ordered all the pillows in his castle sewn permanently to their beds. Yet as the dust settled and Europe adjusted to this new pillowless reality, a curious thing happened. The very prohibition that was meant to quash the trend only deepened its mythology. In taverns and market squares, men whispered of the great pillow war as if it had been some golden age of revelry now lost to history. Enterprising relic sellers began offering feathers from the Pope's own pillow they were not. Minstrels composed ballads about legendary pillow fighters of yore. And in the darkest hours of night, when even the most vigilant bishop slept, a stubborn few still gathered in cellars and barns to swing forbidden pillows with the furtive excitement of heretics, conducting a forbidden rite. Urban VI, for his part, never spoke of the matter again. But those who attended him in his final years noted that he developed an unusual habit. Whenever presented with a new cushion for his chair or bed, he would examine it closely, press it cautiously with his fingers as if testing for hidden firmness, and only then permit it to remain in his presence. And on one memorable occasion, when a particularly ambitious cardinal presented him with an embroidered pillow as a gift, the aging pontiff was seen to shudder slightly before having it removed from his sight. The lesson, it seemed, had been learned, though perhaps not in the way anyone had intended. For while the Pope had succeeded in banishing pillow fights from public view, he could never quite eradicate them from the human heart. Some temptations, no matter how soft, proved harder to smother than others. Chapter 6. The Edict of Fluff. The original draft of the papal decree was merciless. Penned in Urban VI's own hand, it called pillow fights a gateway to moral dissolution and an affront to Christian dignity, demanding their complete eradication under penalty of excommunication. The document specified harsh punishments: confiscation of all decorative cushions from noble households, public penance for offenders, and a mandatory year of sleeping on bare wooden planks for repeat violators. The Pope's advisers blanched as they read the uncompromising text, exchanging nervous glances across the candlelit scriptorium where they had gathered to finalize the edict. Cardinal Orsini, ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "Your Holiness, might we consider?" He hesitated, searching for a diplomatic phrase. "A more measured approach?" The Pope's withering glare suggested the question itself bordered on heresy, but Orsini pressed on. "The nobility are like children. Forbid them something outright, and they'll only want it more." He gestured to the latest reports from France, where 3 counts had already been caught hosting secret pillow tournaments in wine cellars, barely a week after the initial ban. For 3 days, the Vatican's finest legal minds debated the wording. Canon lawyers pored over ancient texts, searching for precedent. A nervous young scribe suggested that perhaps St. Augustine had written something about recreational activities, only to be shouted down by a rotund archivist who insisted the saint would have never condoned such frivolity. The debate grew so heated that at one point 2 clerics nearly came to blows over whether a particularly firm bolster could technically be considered a weapon of moral corruption. The tension broke only when an elderly Monsignor dozed off mid-argument, his head landing on a pile of parchment with a soft thump that reminded everyone present exactly what they were arguing about. Urban VI, meanwhile, found himself besieged by unexpected opposition. The King of Naples sent an emissary bearing gifts and a carefully worded letter suggesting the ban might strain relations with certain powerful families. The Archbishop of Cologne pointed out with irritating logic that if they condemned pillow fights, they might have to prohibit other forms of harmless merriment. What next? A ban on snowball fights. Even the Pope's own housekeeper, a formidable woman who had ruled the papal apartments for decades, dared to remark that men needed some outlet for their foolishness, and better pillows than swords. The final straw came when the Pope's favorite nephew, a young priest of generally impeccable behavior, was discovered teaching altar boys a modified version of the sport using folded vestments. When dragged before his uncle to explain himself, the young man offered a simple defense: "But it makes them happy." The plea struck Urban with unexpected force. That night, alone in his chambers, the aging pontiff found himself staring at the embroidered pillow on his own bed, a gift from his mother, long deceased. He pressed a hand to its surface, remembering how she would tousle his hair with affectionate swats from just such a cushion when he was a boy. When the revised edict was finally published, the changes were subtle but significant. The sweeping condemnations remained, but the punishments grew curiously soft. No more confiscations, no mandatory plank sleeping, just a modest fine to be paid in alms for the poor. Most tellingly, a new clause had been inserted. While the wanton abuse of pillows remains forbidden, their proper use as instruments of rest and comfort is hereby affirmed as pleasing in the eyes of God. The nobles, quick to spot loopholes, seized on this distinction immediately. Within weeks, devotional pillow demonstrations began appearing across Europe, carefully choreographed displays where participants would gently tap cushions together in rhythmic patterns said to represent biblical scenes. A particularly inventive troupe in Venice staged the Slumber of the Righteous, a performance where 12 men in nightcaps reenacted Jacob's ladder dream through carefully coordinated pillow movements. The local bishop, torn between amusement and duty, ultimately declared it probably not heretical. Urban VI, watching these developments from Rome, surprised his advisers by chuckling at one particularly florid report. "Let them have their games," he murmured, before adding sternly, "so long as they remember their prayers." The cardinal secretary, sensing an opportunity, dared to ask if perhaps the church might consider officially sanctioning some form of regulated pillow activity. The Pope's response, a pillow snatched from his chair and flung with surprising accuracy at the cardinal's head, suggested some boundaries remained firm. And so the Edict of Fluff passed into history. Neither the total ban Urban had originally envisioned, nor the free license the nobility desired, but something in between, much like the pillows themselves, firm enough to maintain order, soft enough to permit some comfort. In later years, theologians would debate whether the compromise represented wisdom or weakness. But the common people, who had watched the whole affair with bemused detachment, knew the truth. Sometimes, the holiest path is the one that leaves room for a little softness. In the end, the only lasting casualty was the Vatican's supply of writing quills. The great pillow wars had left Europe with a surplus of loose feathers, and suddenly no scribe worth his salt would use anything but battle-tested quills plucked from tournament pillows. It was said these feathers carried a special resilience, having survived both combat and papal condemnation. A fitting symbol, perhaps, for an institution that had learned, however reluctantly, that some traditions, no matter how silly, could not be fully suppressed. Like feathers on the wind, they always found a way to float back. Chapter 7. The Loophole of the Holy Pillow. The nobles of Europe, faced with the Pope's tempered but firm restrictions on their beloved pillow fights, reacted as aristocracy always does when confronted with rules, by finding the most elaborate possible way to circumvent them. What began as scattered attempts to disguise the sport soon blossomed into an art form of pious subterfuge, a masterclass in medieval loophole exploitation that would have made even the most cunning canon lawyers weep with admiration. It started in Milan, where the cunning Count Visconti, having lost 3 household servants to more conventional attempts at covert pillow brawls, hit upon a stroke of genius. Assembling his household in the castle's great hall, he announced they would be performing a living tableau of the biblical story of David and Goliath. The servants, initially relieved at avoiding another night of secretive feather-flinging, grew suspicious when the Count began measuring them for authentic shepherd's robes lined with unusually thick padding. Their fears were confirmed when the giant's roll went not to the tallest servant, but to the one with the strongest swing, and when the slingshot turned out to be a silk cushion with convenient handholds. By the time the local bishop arrived to investigate reports of ungodly noise, he found the castle's residents engaged in what appeared to be a solemn religious reenactment. True, the Goliath was swinging his pillow with alarming enthusiasm, and the David seemed to be dodging with the practiced footwork of a tournament veteran, but who could argue with Scripture? The bishop, torn between suspicion and the need to maintain good relations with his wealthiest patron, ultimately blessed the performance and requested only that next time they include more psalms between strikes. News of the Milanese success spread like feathers in a stiff breeze. Soon, castles across Christendom echoed with the sounds of devotional exercises. In Burgundy, the Duke hosted a week-long festival of sacred rest, where participants demonstrated various holy men's sleeping positions through vigorous pillow placement. The climax came when 12 knights reenacted Jacob wrestling the angel, a scene that somehow required 6 pillows per participant and left half the actors needing actual medical attention. The French elevated the practice to new heights of absurdity by inventing Les Saints Oreilles, the holy pillows, a liturgical calendar's worth of cushion-based hagiography. Each month celebrated a different saint's connection to sleep or comfort. January honored Saint Drogo, patron of coffee substitutes, with competitors balancing pillows on their heads while drinking bitter herbal infusions. March featured the feast of Saint Joseph the Dreamer, marked by elaborate pillow forts said to represent biblical visions. The pièce de résistance came in December with the Festival of the Nativity Pillow, where participants recreated the Holy Family's journey by passing a specially blessed cushion from person to person while fending off Herod's soldiers with bolsters. The Church's response was a masterwork of strained diplomacy. Local priests, many of whom enjoyed the festivities themselves, developed an elaborate winking vocabulary to describe the events in their reports to Rome. What might have been called a brutal pillow tournament in less charitable times became an enthusiastic veneration of blessed repose. Broken bones were mortifications of the flesh in imitation of the saints. Feathers embedded in beards were miraculous signs of angelic visitation. Rome itself became embroiled in the charade when Cardinal Borgia, never one to miss an opportunity for spectacle, hosted a theological symposium on sacred sleep in the Vatican gardens. Dozens of churchmen attended what was supposedly a learned discussion on dreams in the lives of the prophets. Observers noted the suspicious number of cushions provided and the way every speaker seemed to punctuate theological points by thumping his lectern pillow with particular emphasis. When a visiting bishop from England naively asked why so many participants wore padded gloves, he was solemnly informed they were relic gloves meant to honor St. Bede's writing calluses. The Pope, though privately amused by his clergy's creativity, recognized the danger in allowing the farce to continue unchecked. Yet outright condemnation risked turning the nobles from clever loophole finders into outright rebels. His solution displayed the political acumen that had kept him in power through countless crises. He announced a new category of indulgence pillows, specially blessed cushions that, when used for proper devotional rest, carried partial remission of sins. The nobles, sensing both victory and a new avenue for one-upmanship, fell over themselves to commission the most extravagant versions, embroidered with biblical scenes and stuffed with feathers from sacred geese. Of course, what constituted proper devotional rest remained deliciously vague. The indulgence pillows found their way into tournaments under new names: spiritual discipline aids or penitential comfort instruments. Bishops charged with overseeing their use developed conveniently poor eyesight when particularly enthusiastic prayer kneelers seemed to be making contact with each other's heads at high velocity. An entire cottage industry sprang up around testing pillows for appropriate firmness for spiritual exercises, with guilds of professional fluffers attaining minor nobility status. The greatest testament to the scheme's success came not from the nobility, but from the common people. Seeing their betters getting away with holy pillow fighting, peasants began staging their own folk piety versions, though with sacks of straw rather than fine goose down. When a particularly zealous local priest tried to stop one such event in Flanders, the villagers solemnly explained they were reenacting the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, with the straw-stuffed sacks representing arrows. The priest, after a moment's consideration, joined in and reportedly scored 3 direct hits on the miller's son. Thus did Europe enter its golden age of holy pillowcraft, where every strike could be a prayer and every feather potentially sacred. The original ban remained technically in effect, but like so many medieval prohibitions, it had been softened through collective creativity and into something far more interesting. A testament to humanity's endless ability to dress up its pleasures in vestments of piety. And if sometimes, late at night in the halls of great castles, the sounds of devotional exercises grew suspiciously rowdy, well, that was between the participants and their confessors. As for Pope Urban VI, he kept on his bedside table a small unadorned cushion, the very one his mother had given him as a boy. Those who attended him in his final years claimed that sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would give it an affectionate pat, as if acknowledging the truth they all knew. Some traditions, no matter how silly, have a way of enduring, even, perhaps especially, when wrapped in the cloak of holiness. Chapter 8. Feathers and Fasting. As the pillow-fighting craze collided with the rigid calendar of medieval Christianity, an unexpected tension emerged between spiritual austerity and feather-filled indulgence. The Church's fasting seasons, meant to be periods of solemn reflection and physical denial, became instead a battleground where pious intentions met the irresistible softness of forbidden cushions. What began as innocent recreation now carried the weight of moral transgression, as feathers became the scandalous luxury no one could resist. Lent of 1382 proved particularly disastrous. The Archbishop of Mainz, determined to set an example of perfect Lenten observance, announced he would be sleeping on bare stone throughout the 40 days. His flock, moved by this display of devotion, immediately began debating whether pillow fighting constituted breaking the fast. Traditionalists argued that any pleasure taken from feathers violated the spirit of self-denial. Progressives countered that since pillows were used for sleeping, and sleep was necessary for health, their use was technically medicinal. The more creatively corrupt pointed out that Christ himself had rested his head somewhere during his 40 days in the wilderness. Who were they to reject such holy precedent? The debate reached fever pitch when the Count Palatine hosted his annual pre-Lenten pillow tournament, mere hours before Ash Wednesday services were to begin. Revelers, caught between the desire to make merry before the fast and the knowledge they should already be in a penitential mood, created a bizarre hybrid event where participants swung pillows with one hand while clutching rosaries in the other. The local priest, arriving to bless the gathering, found himself caught in a theological dilemma when the Count presented him with a special Lenten pillow stuffed with dried peas instead of feathers. Was this mortification or indulgence? The priest hesitated just long enough for someone to stuff the cushion down the back of his robes, at which point the question became academic. As Lent progressed, reports flooded into Rome of nobles finding increasingly creative ways to reconcile their feather habits with religious observance. A Burgundian duchess claimed her embroidered pillows were visual aids for meditating on Christ's suffering. The harder they were, the better they represented the stones of Golgotha. A monastery in Bavaria began selling penitential pillows filled with scratchy wool that allegedly induced holy dreams through discomfort. Their popularity lasted exactly one night before monks quietly switched back to goose down and blamed any reports of comfort on miraculous intervention. The situation reached its nadir during Holy Week, when the Bishop of Tours walked into his cathedral to find the nave filled with nobles participating in what was billed as a passion play. The reenactment of Christ's flagellation had somehow evolved into a free-for-all where Romans and disciples alike pelted each other with cushions, while a long-suffering volunteer in a Jesus costume tried in vain to carry a giant stuffed cross to the altar. The bishop's subsequent letter to Rome contained what may have been history's first use of the phrase sacrilegious fluffiness. Meanwhile, common folk developed their own traditions around feathers and fasting. Peasants who could never afford real down pillows marked Lent by removing straw from their bed sacks, while secretly envying the nobility's ability to sin in such luxurious fashion. Midwives began advising pregnant women that feather pillows were exempt from fasting laws by special Marian dispensation, a claim that, while wholly invented, showed remarkable understanding of both theology and maternal comfort needs. The Church's attempts to regulate feather use during holy seasons led to some of the most bizarre theological debates of the late Middle Ages. A council in Avignon spent 3 days arguing whether a feather that had touched meat during a fast day made the pillow itself non-Lenten. The University of Paris's theology faculty published a 200-page treatise on whether feathers counted as foul for fasting purposes, concluding they did not, but only after one overzealous scholar attempted to eat a pillow to prove his point. By Easter, the entire continent seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as pillows emerged from their semi-clandestine status. Churches that had quietly removed cushions from pews during Lent suddenly reinstated them with almost indecent enthusiasm. The Pope himself, while maintaining official disapproval, was rumored to have celebrated the resurrection by enjoying his first properly supported night's sleep in weeks. Yet the legacy of that strange season lingered. A new category of sin had entered the confessional: feather gluttony. Penitents now admitted not just to overeating during fasts, but to secretly hugging pillows when they thought no one was looking. A thriving black market developed for Lenten feathers, ostensibly plucked during approved meat days, but often suspiciously fresh. And in castles across Europe, nobles began storing their finest cushions with the same secrecy others reserved for hidden salt pork, waiting for the next fasting season to once again test the boundaries between piety and comfort. Perhaps the final word belonged to an anonymous monk who scribbled in the margin of a liturgical manuscript, "If God had meant man to suffer without cushions, he would not have made geese so soft." The sentiment, while theologically questionable, captured the essential truth the Church was slowly realizing, that some human weaknesses were too deeply stuffed into the fabric of existence to ever be fully extracted. Better, perhaps, to focus on greater sins and let the feathers fall where they may. Chapter 9. The Pillow Fight Underground. The papal restrictions on pillow fights did not eradicate them, they simply made them more interesting. What had once been an open pastime of the nobility now became a shadowy subculture, complete with secret handshakes, coded messages, and an elaborate network of informants who could be bribed to look the other way. The great pillow underground of the late 14th century was a masterpiece of medieval espionage, where silk-clad conspirators whispered about batting techniques in confessionals, and smugglers transported contraband goose down in hollowed-out loaves of bread. The first sign that pillow fighting had gone clandestine was the sudden popularity of bizarrely specific church donations. Nobles, who had once flaunted their wealth, with golden chalices now commissioned suspiciously pillow-shaped reliquaries, their velvet exteriors embroidered with saints who just so happened to be depicted mid-nap. One particularly brazen lord in Toulouse donated an entire set of prayer kneelers to his local monastery, each one filled with just enough feathers to make it pliant, but not so many as to arouse immediate suspicion. The monks, who were not fools, accepted the gift with solemn gratitude before quietly relocating them to their private quarters for testing. Invitations to these illicit gatherings were works of art and subterfuge. What appeared to be a standard summons to a Lenten meditation retreat might contain hidden meanings. A request to bring your most comforting thoughts was code for bring your best pillow, while the phrase "we shall contemplate the nature of rest" meant the host expected a full-contact bout. One surviving example from a Venetian noblewoman's correspondence includes what seems like an innocent recipe for quail stew, until one notices the repeated references to fluffing the herbs and beating the mixture until light as air. Locations shifted constantly to avoid detection. Abandoned barns, half-built cathedrals, and even the occasional crypt became temporary battlegrounds where the elite could swing forbidden cushions without fear of ecclesiastical reprimand. The most infamous venue was the so-called down crypt beneath a monastery in Champagne, where monks sympathetic to the cause would look the other way as muffled thumps and occasional shouts of "Take that, you heretic!" echoed up through the floor grates. The crypt's popularity lasted until the abbot, who had been receiving a cut of the betting profits, suddenly developed a crisis of conscience and threatened to expose them all. The crisis was resolved when someone anonymously left an exquisitely comfortable pillow on his bed, and he decided some sins were, perhaps, not worth mentioning in his next confession. The pillows themselves became marvels of covert engineering. Disguised as everything from books of hours, the Gospel of Fluff could be opened to reveal a small but serviceable cushion, to armored breastplates with removable padding that could be deployed in seconds. They allowed enthusiasts to always be prepared for sudden combat. A thriving black market emerged for blind pillows, cushions smuggled inside blindfolded messenger pigeons, which would arrive at their destination unaware they had carried contraband. Church authorities, for their part, vacillated between genuine attempts to enforce the ban and quiet acceptance that this was a war they might not win. Some priests took to performing surprise inspections of noble households, feeling beds for suspicious warmth that might indicate recent use. Others, perhaps more pragmatically, began charging a devotional fluff tax, a small fee in exchange for not noticing the feathers clinging to their parishioners' clothes. The greatest irony was that the crackdown had transformed pillow fighting from a frivolous pastime into something resembling an act of rebellion. Young nobles who had once participated out of boredom now did so with the fervor of revolutionaries, whispering slogans like "Down with down prohibition" and "Fluff shall be free," as they dueled in moonlit orchards. A minor poet from Provence even composed an epic ballad, Why the Pillow Knight, about a heroic warrior who fought against tyranny, armed only with a sword of silk and a shield. The song was banned in 3 dioceses, which only made it more popular. By the time Pope Urban VI received reports that pillow fighting had not only persisted but evolved into an elaborate counterculture, he was too weary to fight it. Legend claims he summoned his most trusted advisor and asked, in a voice heavy with resignation, "Is there any chance they'll grow tired of this nonsense on their own?" When the advisor hesitated, the Pope sighed and reached for his seal. The resulting decree, a masterpiece of ecclesiastical doublespeak, officially maintained the prohibition while adding so many exceptions for devotional use, charitable pillow distributions, and therapeutic exercises that nearly any gathering could be justified. And so the pillow underground persisted, if not quite legally, then at least without fear of serious reprisal. To this day, in the vaulted cellars of old European castles, guides will sometimes point out odd markings on the walls, scuffs that might, if one squints, resemble the arc of a well-swung cushion. And if the wind blows just right through certain medieval streets, you might still hear the faint, ghostly git-thump of a long-ago strike landing true, the echo of a time when feathers were contraband and the softest rebellion in history was fought one pillow at a time. Chapter 10. The Merchant of Pillows. As the Church's restrictions on pillow fighting tightened, an underworld of feather merchants emerged from the shadows, crafty opportunists who recognized that nothing drives demand like prohibition. These dealers in clandestine comfort operated in the gray spaces between piety and pleasure, smuggling luxurious down-filled pillows to nobles desperate for illicit midnight brawls. Their trade routes wound through back alleys and monastery cellars, their goods hidden in everything from funeral biers to shipments of sacramental wine. The most notorious of these merchants was a Genoese smuggler known only as Il Piumato, the Feathered One. A man of many disguises, wool merchant, relic salesman, itinerant friar, he specialized in what he called combat-grade down, pillows stuffed with just the right balance of goose feathers to deliver satisfying thwacks without losing loft. His signature product, the E.G. Cusino dell'Angelo, came wrapped in pious-looking linen, embroidered with tiny crosses, allowing owners to claim they were devotional objects if caught. Business thrived until an overzealous customer in Florence accidentally knocked out a bishop with one during an inspection, revealing the holy stitching to be covering a layer of carefully stitched-in lead weights. Other merchants devised increasingly creative methods to evade detection. In Bruges, a blind widow named Marguerite ran a thriving pillow black market from her tapestry workshop, weaving secret compartments into wall hangings where nobles could hide contraband cushions during raids. Her most popular design featured a hunting scene where, if one pulled the right thread, a hidden panel would slide open to reveal enough feathers to outfit a small tournament. When no authorities finally grew suspicious, she calmly claimed the feathers were for stuffing pincushions, a story backed by every seamstress in the city, all of whom suddenly developed an unusual need for hundreds of goose-down pincushions overnight. The ports of Venice became hubs for international pillow smuggling. Dark-eyed merchants from the east brought shipments of exotic fillings, phoenix feathers from Alexandria, actually chicken down, dyed crimson, cloud wool from Mongol traders, ordinary sheep's fleece with a markup, and the legendary silkworm, down from Cathay that turned out to be cleverly carded mulberry fibers. Customs officials found themselves in endless debates about whether certain imports counted as bedding or textiles, while smugglers laughed all the way to their hidden warehouses. Quality control became a life or death matter in this shadow trade. Professional fluff testers emerged as a new class of artisan, their sensitive fingers capable of judging a pillow's battle-worthiness by touch alone. The best could detect inferior duck feathers mixed into goose down, or spot the telltale lumpiness of a cushion that had been hastily restuffed after confiscation. In Nuremberg, the Fluff Testers Guild maintained a secret grading system, stamping approved pillows with tiny, nearly invisible marks that indicated whether they were suited for light sparring or full-contact duels. The Church's attempts to regulate this trade led to some of the most absurd legal proceedings of the era. In one memorable case from Siena, a merchant stood trial for heresy after being caught selling pillows stuffed with pages from outdated indulgences. His defense? That the ink made the feathers fall more dramatically, almost swayed the court until someone pointed out he'd used a particularly rare papal bull as batting. The bishop sentencing him couldn't decide whether to be more offended by the sacrilege or impressed by the man's eye for quality parchment. As enforcement tightened, pillow technology advanced. Cushions grew lighter and more lethal, their castings reinforced with silk threads that wouldn't split during vigorous combat. Some nobles commissioned personalized pillows with their coats of arms woven into the fabric, while others preferred anonymous dueling pillows that could be quickly disowned if discovered. The truly paranoid invested in burned pillows, stuffed with flax instead of feathers. They could be tossed into a fireplace at a moment's notice, leaving no evidence but a suspiciously downy smoke. The black market's golden age came to an abrupt end when authorities realized the same network smuggling pillows were also transporting far more dangerous contraband. A raid on a Bologna feather warehouse uncovered not just illegal cushions, but stolen relics, banned books, and a startling number of uncaged parrots of suspicious origin. Almost overnight, the Church shifted from targeting pillow fights to hunting the larger criminal networks, leaving nobles to resume their feathery hobbies with only token interference. Yet, the legacy of these merchants endured. For generations afterward, certain families would whisper about hidden compartments in their ancestral homes, where grandfather's battle pillow still waited, its feathers flattened by time but still holding the memory of midnight tournaments. And in the back rooms of Europe's oldest textile shops, you might still find an elderly merchant who, after careful vetting of a customer's character, will murmur the old code phrase, "Are you in need of something?" Soft. Proving that some markets, no matter how vigorously suppressed, never truly disappear. They just learn better ways to hide in plain sight. Chapter 11. The Archbishop's Secret Passion. In the hallowed halls of the Vatican, where cardinals whispered of heresy and theologians debated the nature of the divine, one man harbored a secret that would have scandalized the papal court far more than any doctrinal dispute. Archbishop Rinaldo Orsini, the Pope's own treasurer and confessor, was indisputably the finest pillow duelist in Rome. The Archbishop's double life began innocently enough. As a young bishop, he had attended a gathering where noblemen demonstrated this new pious recreation. While others pretended pious disinterest, Rinaldo found himself captivated by the artistry of it, the way a well-swung cushion could arc through candlelight, the satisfying thump of feathers meeting their mark. That night, in the privacy of his chambers, he practiced with the bolsters until dawn, his mattress stripped bare of its padding. By the time he rose to prominence in Rome, Rinaldo had perfected his technique. He trained in secret, using weighted pillows to build strength in his arms until he could deliver blows that would knock a man flat without splitting the seam. He studied the physics of feathers, learning how different fills affected a pillow's balance and impact. Most brilliantly, he developed the Orsini feint, a move where he appeared to stumble during a theological debate, only to suddenly whirl and deliver a devastating strike from an unexpected angle. The Archbishop's secret matches took place in the most unlikely locations. Beneath the Vatican Library, where dusty tomes muffled the sounds of combat. In the catacombs, where the dead made discreet spectators. Once, memorably, in the papal gardens themselves, where Rinaldo and an unsuspecting visiting bishop from Cologne engaged in what was later officially recorded as vigorous prayer. Rinaldo's greatest challenge came when Cardinal Borgia, himself no stranger to illicit pillow fights, grew suspicious. The cardinal had noticed peculiar things: feathers clinging to the Archbishop's robes, servants carrying suspiciously lumpy vestment bags, an unusual number of broken lectern cushions in rooms where Rinaldo gave sermons. When Borgia confronted him directly, Rinaldo did the only thing he could. He challenged the cardinal to a duel. Their midnight match in the Sistine Chapel became legendary. Borgia fought dirty, using a pillow stuffed with dried peas that stung like hail. Rinaldo countered with his signature silk-covered cushion, its surface so smooth it slipped through Borgia's defenses like a whisper. They battled between half-finished frescoes, dodging scaffolding, their grunts and thuds echoing off biblical scenes of divine judgment. The duel ended in a draw when both men, exhausted, collapsed onto a pile of painters' dropcloths. As they lay panting, staring up at Michelangelo's unfinished Genesis scenes, Borgia gasped out the question that had haunted him. Why? Rinaldo, wiping sweat from his brow, gave the answer that would later become famous among pillow-fighting clergy, because even angels must fluff their wings sometimes. From that night forward, an understanding passed between them. Borgia became Rinaldo's most frequent opponent and closest conspirator. Together they established the Sacred Order of the Fluffy, a secret society of high-ranking churchmen who met monthly to spar in abandoned chapels. Their membership grew to include 7 cardinals, 3 bishops, and surprisingly, the Pope's own elderly cook, whose arthritis prevented him from swinging, but whose strategic mind made him an excellent referee. Rinaldo's dual life reached its peak during the Council of Trent. While churchmen debated transubstantiation, he secretly organized a tournament in the wine cellars beneath the meeting hall. Prelates from across Europe battled under the cover of theological breakout sessions, their muffled thumps drowned out by particularly heated doctrinal arguments upstairs. The final match between Rinaldo and a giant Swedish bishop lasted so long that both men missed 3 votes on predestination. The Archbishop's secret might have died with him, had not a particularly observant novice once noticed something peculiar. Delivering a message to Rinaldo's chambers, the young monk found the normally stern churchman shirtless and gleaming with sweat, practicing his swings before a full-length mirror. Frozen in the doorway, the novice watched as Rinaldo executed a perfect spinning strike that sent a candlestick flying, only to catch it mid-air with his other hand. Instead of reporting what he'd seen, the novice did something unexpected. He bowed deeply and said, "My lord, might I fetch you a fresh pillow? That one appears to be losing its loft." Rinaldo, after a moment of stunned silence, laughed louder than he had in years. The novice became his protégé, inheriting both his secret passion and his legendary collection of battle pillows. To this day, guides in the Vatican museums still puzzle over a particular notation in old inventory logs, a mysterious chamber of sacred repose that appears on no floor plan. Some claim it was Rinaldo's private training room, its walls still bearing the faint impressions of countless feather-filled blows. Others whisper that the tradition continues, and that if you walk the hallowed halls late enough at night, you might still hear the distant rhythmic thump of cardinals keeping the faith in their own peculiar way. As for Rinaldo, he died as he lived, with a pillow in his hands. On his deathbed, when the priest came to administer last rites, the old Archbishop's final act was to deliver one perfectly placed tap to the man's shoulder with his childhood bolster. His last words, according to those present, were not a prayer but a satisfied murmur. "Now that was a good swing." Chapter 12. The Great Pillow Amnesty. By the turn of the 15th century, the Church found itself facing an uncomfortable truth. Centuries of prohibitions had failed to eradicate pillow fighting. If anything, the restrictions had only made the sport more alluring, transforming what had been a silly aristocratic pastime into a full-blown cultural phenomenon with secret societies, underground tournaments, and its own coded language. Meanwhile, Europe's nobility continued their more traditional hobbies of stabbing each other over land disputes and marital slights. It was during a particularly bloody feud between the houses of Medici and Sforza that a weary cardinal voiced the heretical thought that had been bubbling beneath the surface of papal discussions for decades. At least when they're hitting each other with pillows, they're not using actual weapons. The idea took root slowly. Bishops began noticing that regions with vigorous pillow-fighting cultures reported fewer fatal duels. A Dominican friar in Florence compiled a startling report showing that for every 100 nobles engaged in regular feather combat, sword-related fatalities dropped by nearly half. Even the Pope's own physicians noted that participants in these soft wars slept better and showed fewer signs of the nervous agitation that so often led to more violent outbursts. The turning point came during the Council of Constance in 1417, when two rival patriarchs nearly came to blows over a theological dispute. As the assembly devolved into shouting, Archbishop Orsini's successor, knowing the secret history of his office, quietly produced 2 perfectly balanced pillows from beneath his robes. "If you must fight," he sighed, "do it properly." The resulting match, fought between solemn votes on church doctrine, not only settled the argument but provided the most entertainment the staid gathering had seen in weeks. Watching 2 elderly churchmen whack each other into breathless exhaustion proved unexpectedly persuasive. When the newly elected Pope Martin received a formal proposal to lift the ban, he initially balked. Then his advisors presented him with a carefully curated demonstration. 2 pages from rival Roman families, their clans locked in a generations-old blood feud, were brought into the Vatican gardens and given pillows. What followed was less a fight than a cathartic release. Years of inherited grievances poured into feather-filled blows, until both boys collapsed laughing in a pile of down. The Pope, hiding a smile beneath his hand, murmured, "This may be the most effective peace treaty I've ever witnessed." The great pillow amnesty was announced on the Feast of the Archangels, a fitting date for a decree about sanctioned combat. The papal bull, Pluma Passes, declared that while the Church still disapproved of excessive violence, pillow fighting would henceforth be tolerated as a lesser evil and occasional instrument of concord. A list of recommended guidelines followed. No weighted pillows, no strikes to the face, mandatory breaks for prayer, and absolutely no fighting during Lent. A compromise that satisfied no one but was grudgingly accepted. The nobility reacted with predictable enthusiasm. Within weeks, castles across Europe held reconciliation tournaments, where long-feuding families settled disputes through feather combat rather than steel. The Duke of Burgundy established the first formal league, with rules overseen by a panel of monks trained as referees. In Venice, the once clandestine pillow-fighting guilds emerged into sunlight, their members now wearing official insignia, embroidered with crossed pillows beneath a dove of peace. The Church's about-face inspired some creative reinterpretations of history. Suddenly, clergy recalled that King David had comforted himself with pillows during trials, a dubious reading of scripture at best. Artists began including pillows in religious scenes. A small cushion conspicuously appeared at the feet of the Virgin in several Annunciation paintings. One particularly enterprising friar in Assisi claimed St. Francis had tamed a wolf not with kindness, but by besting it in a pillow fight, a story that became wildly popular despite being entirely fabricated. Not everyone embraced the change. Traditionalists grumbled about moral decay. A group of dour monks in the Alps took to wearing hair shirts stuffed with prickly thistles as protest against the new culture of softness. The most ardent critic, a firebrand preacher from Saxony, traveled from town to town burning pillows in bonfires until he choked on the resulting feather smoke and had to be rescued by the very cushion makers he'd been decrying. As years passed, the sport became institutionalized. Young nobles learned pillow combat alongside swordsmanship. Treatises were written on technique. The Arte della Civicaline, by a Florentine master, became the foundational text, detailing everything from proper grip to the ethics of sneak attack. The Church even sanctioned annual feather festivals, where communities would gather to settle minor disputes through organized pillow battles, followed by communal feasting. The final irony came when Pope Martin himself, in his old age, became an unlikely patron of the sport. His private chambers were said to contain an impressive collection of historic pillows, including the very one used in the peace demonstration that changed church policy. When ambassadors from warring states came to him for mediation, he would often begin negotiations by handing them cushions, saying, "Show me what angers you cannot put into words." More than one conflict was averted this way, though the Vatican's laundry staff complained endlessly about the feather cleanup. By the time Martin died, pillow fighting had become so ingrained in European culture that people barely remembered it had ever been banned. The once scandalous sport was now considered wholesome recreation, its earlier controversy preserved only in fading edicts and the occasional elderly cleric's muttered warnings about the slippery slope from feathers to sin. In the end, the Great Pillow Amnesty stood as proof of a truth the Church had slowly come to understand. Sometimes the path to peace isn't through prohibition, but through giving people a softer way to fight. And if the sound of muffled thumps and laughter now regularly echoed through castle halls, where once only the clash of steel had been heard, well, as one reformed swordsman turned pillow champion put it, "At least now when I lose an argument, I can blame the feathers." Chapter 13. A Legacy of Fluff. The echoes of the Great Pillow Amnesty rippled far beyond the stone walls of medieval castles and cathedrals, shaping traditions that would endure for centuries in ways both profound and absurd. Though the papal edicts yellowed in archives and the secret pillow societies faded into history, their legacy lived on in every feather that escaped a burst seam, in every playful swat exchanged between siblings, in every hotel guest who couldn't resist testing a pillow's heft with an experimental swing. Modern sleep culture owes its quirks to those turbulent centuries. The very concept of a pillow fight as innocent fun was forged in the fires of ecclesiastical debate. Before the ban, pillows were purely functional. After the amnesty, they became objects of rebellion, joy, and even artistry. The tradition of testing a pillow's fluffiness before purchase, a direct descendant of the black market fluff testers who once graded contraband cushions for nobles. The childhood rite of sneaking a pillow into a sibling's room for a midnight ambush. A watered-down echo of the clandestine raids of medieval nobles who dueled in crypts. Even the phrase "don't take it lying down" is said to have originated from the habit of defeated duelists dramatically collapsing onto piles of cushions after a particularly humiliating strike. Professional pillow fighting leagues, though now a niche sport, carry the torch of those early tournaments. Their regulations, no weighted cores, no strikes above the shoulders, mandatory feather containment sleeves, are direct evolutions of the Church's compromise rules. The Champions Trophy in the Berlin International Pillow Fighting Championship is still shaped like a bishop's mitre, a nod to the sport's clerical patrons, and the ceremonial blessing of the pillows before major matches. A tradition started by a winking 15th-century priest who found it easier to sanctify the sport than to stamp it out. The hospitality industry, too, bears the marks of this history. The first luxury hotels in 18th century Paris competed not just with thread counts but with pillow fight readiness, advertising their noble-grade bolsters and duel-worthy down. A famous Viennese hotelier once boasted that his housekeepers could identify a seasoned pillow fighter by the way they reflexively fluffed their cushions upon entering a room. To this day, high-end hotels discreetly reinforce their pillows with double stitching, a silent homage to the medieval obsession with durability. Even language preserves the legacy. The term feather-brained originally described nobles who neglected their duties for pillow tournaments. Fighting like a wet hen comes not from poultry, but from the disastrous 1392 match, where a duke's prized combat pillows got soaked in a rainstorm, rendering them useless. And the phrase "beating around the bush" evolved from the tactic of circling an opponent to avoid a direct pillow strike. Perhaps the most enduring testament, though, lies in the unbroken chain of rebellion and comfort. Every time a child evades bedtime by declaring a spontaneous pillow war, they reenact the defiance of nobles who refuse to let the church dictate their pleasures. Every hotel maid who finds a pile of pillows arranged like fortifications is witnessing the same instinct that once drove cardinals to duel in secret chapels. And every time someone, in a moment of frustration, grabs the nearest cushion and screams into it, they are participating in a tradition far older than therapy. A tradition that began when humanity first realized that some problems can be solved. In the quietest corners of museums, if you know where to look, you'll find artifacts of this strange history. A 16th century painting of a saint taming a demon with a pillow, later revealed to be a commissioned piece by a noble patron. A bishop's crook with a suspiciously pillow-shaped finial. A fragment of tapestry showing two monks mid-swing, their faces blurred by centuries, but their joy unmistakable. These fragments whisper the truth, that what began as a ban nearly snuffed out not just a game, but a fundamental human need to rebel, to connect, to laugh, and to turn even the softest objects into instruments of joy. And so, as you lay your head down tonight, consider this. Your pillow carries more than dreams. It carries the weight of 1,000 years of defiance, the echo of 1,000 muffled thumps, the memory of a time when the world learned that sometimes the softest things endure the longest. The next time a feather escapes its case and drifts lazily through the air, know that it isn't just a nuisance, it's a tiny floating monument to the absurd, glorious resilience of fun.